It's my joy and honor to welcome you to the 12th annual Rohrbach Lecture on Eastern Classics. Tonight, Andrew Nicholson will offer us a lecture on Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. The Rohrbach Lecture, established in memory of Mr. William A. Rohrbach, a 1985 alumnus of the St. John's College undergraduate program in Annapolis, and a 1998 graduate of the Master of Arts in Eastern Classics program in Santa Fe, is held annually on Santa Fe campus. The lecture invites scholars with expertise in Eastern philosophies, theology, arts, and language to explore how Eastern traditions address fundamental human questions in ways that are both similar to and different from the Western great books. Tonight, we are grateful to have William's widow, Elizabeth Rohrbach, a graduate from Annapolis undergraduate program 1985 and Eastern Classics program 2003, here in attendance with us. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Andrew J. Nicholson, who will deliver tonight's lecture. Mr. Nicholson is Associate Professor at Stony Brook University, State University of New York. He's the author of 2 books and numerous articles on Indian philosophy, intellectual history, and philosophy of religion. His book, Unifying Hinduism, Philosophy and Identity in Indian Intellectual History, won the American Academy of Religion Prize for the best first book in the history of religions. His second book, Lord Shiva's song, the iSvara-Gita, is a translation from Sanskrit of an 8th century Shaiva yoga text. His current book project, entitled The King and the Yogi, Visions of Ethical Perfection in South Asian Thought, looks at the way these 2 figures embody virtues central to discourses of self-transformation from the Vedic period to the 20th century in India. Professor Nicholson holds a Master of Arts in Religious Studies from University of Chicago, an MA in Philosophy from DePaul University, and a PhD in South Asian languages and civilizations from University of Chicago. Mr. Nicholson has also studied Sanskrit, Hindi, Indian philosophy, and yoga with teachers in India. His lecture tonight is titled Theism and Atheism in Patanjali's Yoga, 3 Perspectives. Please welcome Professor Andrew J. Nicholson.
Thank you so much, Topi, for that kind introduction. And thanks to the Rohrbach family for bringing me here. Also, a very wonderful lunch I had with some faculty today, I guess was courtesy of the Rohrbach's generosity, so I really appreciate that. And I appreciate all of you being here on a Friday night to hear about Indian philosophy. This doesn't happen that often, so I really I think it's great to see so many people interested in this text. So I understand that a lot of MA students at St. John's are already quite familiar with Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. So I'm going to ask their indulgence while I spend 15 or 20 minutes just sort of giving some background introductory information for those of you who maybe are not so up on what is going on with Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. So the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali is a text composed in Sanskrit, consisting of 195 sutras. In this context, a sutra means an aphorism, a short saying. So for instance, the second sutra is Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Famously, the definition of yoga in Patanjali is that yoga is the cessation of the turnings of mind. So that's one example of a sutra. It's divided into 4 chapters, and to the best of our knowledge, it was composed around the 4th century of the Common Era in India. There are many commentaries written on this Yoga Sutra, and in fact, I would argue it is very difficult, if not impossible, to understand the meaning of some of these sutras without a commentary. The current scholarly consensus is that the earliest commentary, the Yoga Sutra Bhashya, was actually written by the author himself. Not everyone agrees with this, but I think most scholars, historians working in the field, we have a lot of evidence for this idea of the Bhashya as an auto-commentary. He's commenting on his own text. That may sound strange. Certainly it's a different way of writing text, but it was actually quite common in the first millennium in India. There are other texts, like Buddhist philosophers like Vasubandhu and Asanga, who also wrote auto-commentaries on their own texts. So when I talk about Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, I'm doing so through the commentary called the Bhashya. Another thing you should know is that nowadays people talk about the yoga school of philosophy, and that Patanjali was the founder of that school. But the evidence that we have suggests that that understanding of Patanjali's text as being the founding document of a school called yoga was not actually prevalent in the 4th century, and Patanjali considered himself to be not a quote-unquote yoga philosopher, but a philosopher of Samkhya. Samkhya is one of the oldest schools of philosophy in India. And at the colophon of each chapter, so when there's a manuscript at the end, it says, "Thus ends the first chapter of the Yoga Shastra, the exposition of Sankhya by Patanjali." So that's one piece of evidence that Patanjali was a Sankhya philosopher writing about yoga. And again, I think this might surprise some people, but all the evidence in the text suggests that this is who Patanjali was. He was analyzing yoga through the lens of Sankhya metaphysics. So to start out, then we have to know what Sankhya is all about. So I'm giving you a brief detour to this other ancient school of philosophy in India. So the Sankhya school is a dualistic school. I know there's a cliche that, all Indian philosophers say all is one, but if you're a dualist, you don't say all is one, you say all is two. And that's precisely what the Sankhya school was about. Those of you who might be familiar with Vedanta, such as Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, well, he was an opponent, a very vociferous opponent of the Sankhya school, because they were not monists, they were dualists. Instead of having one fundamental principle, they have two fundamental principles, Prakriti and Purusha. Prakriti is gendered feminine, Purusha is gendered masculine. Purusha we can translate something like spirit or pure consciousness. Prakriti, nature or materiality. Here's a nice chart for you of the 25 tattvas or principles of the Sankhya school. Purusha doesn't do anything. It's just changeless, pure consciousness. And it's what each of us really is. Our essence is Purusha. Other philosophical schools would call this the Atman, the self. On the other hand is Prakriti, this constantly transforming, changing, dynamic principle. The feminine principle in India is the dynamic principle, while the masculine principle is the passive principle. Purusha is masculine and passive. Prakriti is feminine and active. And out of Prakriti comes the 23 other evolutes. I don't want to get too crazy here. This is a chart I borrowed from a philosopher named Richard King, but you can see how all these other things, including our physical realities, things like wind, fire, earth, water, and space come out of it, but so too things like the intellect. The problem, according to Samkhya, is that we mistakenly think that we are the intellect or the ego or the body or the mind, when in fact we are truly none of these things. We are Purusha, pure, unchanging consciousness. So that's the Samkhya school, the school that Patanjali was almost certainly a member of. And he analyzes yoga through the categories, through the metaphysical categories of the Samkhya school. One piece of evidence that Patanjali was a Sankhya philosopher is the very last sutra. What is the goal of yoga? It might surprise you that yoga for him is not about union, some yoga. It's about disunion, viyoga. He says that the ultimate goal, what happens when you truly still those turnings of mind, is the disunion of Purusha and Prakriti. The name the Samkhya school gives for this, and the Patanjali calls it, is Kaivalya, pure aloneness. So each of us is a kind of monad, and our goal is to remove ourselves from this corrupting influence of Prakriti. So he says in the very last sutra, pure aloneness, Kaivalya, is when the strands, the gunas, these three parts of Prakriti, devoid of any purpose for the Purusha, pure consciousness, return to their original state, when the power of consciousness is situated in its own essential nature. So when we stop these turnings of thought, when consciousness is situated in its own essential nature, it stops making the mistake of misidentifying itself as our bodies or our minds or our intellects or our egos. And we exist in our true identity as eternally unchanging, pure consciousness. It's not union. We're not all one. Each of us has a Purusha, separate from every other Purusha, and the goal is Kaivalya, aloneness. A lot of people don't like that, which is why I think a lot of philosophers, including commentators in India, often reinterpret this more along those lines of yoga as union. If you've taken a yoga class, one of the things your teacher probably told you is yoga means union. Etymologically, that's true, but for Patanjali, he understands it through the lens of this Samkhya concept of Kaivalya. So yoga for Patanjali is not doing headstands, shoulder stands, sun salutations, etc. Sorry for those of you who are into that. No aspersions cast. That's wonderful, but that's not what Patanjali was talking about. He was talking about, as I said, yoga as the cessation of the turnings of mind. Chitta vritti nirodha. So what we nowadays call meditation. And indeed, when Buddhist and Samkhya philosophers in the first millennium CE in India talked about yoga, it was typically as meditation, what we call meditation. That posturally focused yoga that is so famous today probably got started around the 11th century of the Common Era. That doesn't mean it's illegitimate or inauthentic, quite the contrary, but it does mean that that's not the earlier understanding of what yoga is all about. And so after you stop your mind turning, when you quiet the mind, the seer abides, that is the Purusha, the seer, abides in his own essential nature. Again, Purusha masculine, Prakriti feminine. So, if you're interested in posture, yes, posture is one of the 8 limbs of yoga. He famously, incidentally, he was not the first person to come up with a list of the 8 limbs of yoga. Patanjali was he was like a magpie. He was borrowing from lots of different earlier traditions, and we find other earlier traditions that talk about 6 limbs or 8 limbs of yoga. But Patanjali's list of 8 limbs was the one that got really famous. So he says, in the 2nd chapter of the Yoga Sutra, the 8 limbs of yoga are abstentions, observances, posture, breath control, sense withdrawal, concentration, meditation, and absorption. So of those 8, the first 5 are considered external, according to Patanjali, and the last 3 are considered internal. The last 3 you might think of as increasingly subtle and focused types of what we nowadays will call meditation. The first 5 are preparing you for that internal, that higher form of meditation that will eventually lead to kaivalya, to liberation, to aloneness, as the Sankhya's call it. So what is posture? Well, Patanjali doesn't give us a whole lot on posture. Posture should be steady and comfortable. He actually dedicates 3 sutras out of 195 to posture. And in the Bhashya, which again I and most scholars nowadays believe was also written by Patanjali, all of the postures that are mentioned are sitting postures, like the lotus or the half lotus or some other postures that you might be familiar with. He doesn't talk about headstands, shoulder stands, etc. And that makes sense because this word posture, asana, comes from a verbal root as in Sanskrit, which means to sit. An asana is literally a seat. So for instance, kings in ancient India sat on thrones called singhasanas, a lion seat. That's what they call a throne back then. So literally, when you talk about asanas, you're talking about sitting or a seated posture. Of course, that meaning got expanded in later times, and by the second millennium in India, they talk a lot more about posture and various hatha yoga, or texts on the yoga of force. That's what hatha means. So that's my little preliminary 20-minute introduction to Patanjali. I know that there were a lot of bewildering Sanskrit words in there. I apologize. That's the danger of being a Sanskrit professor, is that you just start speaking Sanskrit. You can ask me some questions later and we can clarify a few things. But now I want to get into the actual meat of my talk, the main theme I wanted to look at, which is, what does he mean when he talks about God or the Lord in the Yoga Sutras? Because it's there. So there are lots of words for God in Sanskrit, as you might imagine. Here are 2 of them. Of course, Sanskrit is a Indo-European language. It's cognate with Latin and Greek and English and French. And so oftentimes you can see similarities between, say, Latin or English and Sanskrit. So one common word for God is deva. Deva comes from a verb div, which means to shine. So shining beings, radiant beings, are gods. It's cognate with words like divine, divinity in English. Devas are, you might think of a god like Indra, a thunderbolt-wielding god. He's a good example of a deva. He's not a world-creating god. He's more like Zeus or Thor. In fact, there was probably a common Indo-European source for thunderbolt-wielding, powerful, warlike gods such as Zeus, Thor, and Indra. So these devas are super powerful beings, but they aren't omniscient. They aren't even omnipotent. People are pulling things over on Indra and Zeus, and they're making mistakes and getting drugged and falling asleep and being ridiculed. At one point, a sage named Gautama curses Indra. Indra sleeps with Gautama's wife because, like Zeus, he cannot control his kama, his lust. And so, as punishment, this human sage, this mortal sage, curses him with 1,000 yonis all over his body, 1,000 vulvas. And then the gods step in and say, that's not nice, and they change those vulvas, those yonis, to eyes, akshas. And so that's where the epithet, the 1,000-eyed one, comes from for Indra. So Indra is not omniscient or omnipotent. He's full of flaws, like Zeus, like Thor, like a lot of the other gods. So that's one word for God. Another word is iSvara. This word comes from a verb ish in Sanskrit, that little square root sign. That's actually what we Sanskritists use as a verbal root, because most words in Sanskrit are derived from these verbs, like ish, to own or to have mastery. That's what ish means. And that's where this word iSvara comes from. So that's the word that Patanjali is using in this text. He's talking about iSvara. It's also cognate with some words like eigen, if you know German, or own in English. So someone who has mastery or ownership of the entire world. That person is a lord, an Ishvara. So often Ishvara is an epithet used for a creator god like Shiva. In modern India, he's often called Ishvara or Maheshvara, these kinds of words. But it's not entirely clear what Patanjali means by Ishvara, because at certain critical points, Patanjali is maddeningly vague. He doesn't want to tell us the things that we most want to know, which can be frustrating, but it can also be liberating in a way, because it allows commentators to be very creative in their commentaries on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. So, who is this Lord? Well, one of the things Patanjali tells us is the Lord is a distinct Purusha, free from afflictions, karma, the fruits of karma, and subconscious predispositions. So most of us are full of various afflictions. Some of you may know that he lists 5 of these: ignorance, egoism, attachment, aversion, and clinging to life. Those are the 5 kleshas according to Patanjali. If you're a scholar of Buddhism, you might even notice that 3 of these 5 are identical with the 3 poisons of Buddhism: ignorance, attachment, and aversion. So it's pretty clear that besides being a Sankhya philosopher, Patanjali was also a philosopher who was deeply influenced by Buddhist ideas. So most of us, we have attachments, we have aversions, we're bound by karma. Karma means action in Sanskrit. And the fruits of our karma, the consequences of our actions, keep us here suffering, bound to the world. Ishvara is not like us. He is eternally free from all of these bad things that make beings suffer. So, even, Indra was certainly not free from ignorance, attachment, and aversion, right? He's a very warlike god. He's constantly lusting after mortal women. He's not like this Ishvara as it's defined in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And one of the things that Patanjali says is that second of the 8 limbs, the observances, they're called niyamas in Sanskrit. One of these is iSvara-pranidhana, dedication to the Lord, dedication to Ishvara. What's interesting is he doesn't put this at the very top. You might think, Hinduism is all about worshiping God. Of course, the culmination of yoga is going to be some kind of God-centered worship or meditation on God. Patanjali doesn't say that. God is one of the 5 parts of the second rung of the Yoga Sutras, which might be surprising. It might even be offensive. And yes, other schools of philosophy in India were offended by this seemingly very minor place that Patanjali puts dedication to the Lord as the second part of the second rung of yoga. He also says about this Ishvara, in him is the unsurpassed seed of omniscience. Sarvagna bija. Bija is a seed. Sarvagna, all-knowing. So has this seed of omniscience. He's an omniscient being. And he was also the teacher of the ancients, as he is not limited by time. So this is most of the information we have about this Ishvara. He's a teacher, he's not limited by time, he's omniscient. It leaves a lot out. For instance, the sutras and the commentary, the bhashya, doesn't say anything about God creating the world. It doesn't say anything about God's omnipotence, sarva-kartrutva. It says he's omniscient, but it doesn't say anything about omnipotence. So various scholars and commentators and theorists have puzzled over who this iSvara is. And what I'm going to do today is give you 3 perspectives on who iSvara in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras might be. The first one I'll mention comes from a very famous scholar. Some of you may have read Mircea Eliade, not just a theorist of yoga. He wrote a famous book called Yoga, Immortality and Freedom in 1958, but a theorist of comparative religions in general, the founder of the History of Religion School of Interpretation at the University of Chicago, my alma mater. So this is what Eliade says about this iSvara. iSvara's role is comparatively small. He can, for example, bring samadhi, absorption, to the yogin who takes him as the object of concentration. iSvara has none of the grandeur of the omnipotent creator God. All in all, iSvara is only an archetype of the yogin, a macro yogin. So this is Eliade's view that iSvara doesn't actually do anything at all. He has no agency. He has no body. He's just hanging out eternally, this eternally liberated special Purusha free from suffering, who functions as a possible object of a yogi's meditation. Other interpreters like Barbara Stoler-Miller, who has a very popular translation of the Yoga Sutras, she basically follows this idea that Ishvara doesn't do anything. He doesn't own anything. He doesn't have mastery over anything. He's purely passive. So although it's possible to obtain meditation through this, obtain liberation through this meditation on Ishvara, it's kind of a cheat code, I guess you could say nowadays, right? It's not the highest limb of meditation, which is samadhi, meditative absorption, and especially a kind of non-conceptual meditation called nirbija samadhi or nirvikalpika samadhi. That, for Patanjali, seems to be the highest form of yoga. So that's one view. Ishvara is just this passive Purusha that never does anything. Interpretation number 2. A lot of folks in ancient India, especially a lot of worshippers of Shiva and Vishnu, totally disagreed with that idea that God is somehow passive, that God is not powerful. And in fact, disagreed about the very definition of yoga. So another 4th century commentator, roughly contemporary with Patanjali, said, yoga is not chitta-vritti nirodha, it is the union of self, Atman, and the Lord, Ishvara. Atmeshvara samyoga, union, samyoga of the self and the Lord. That seems a lot more familiar, and honestly, I think this school, the Pashupata school of yoga, has a lot more to do with how people who do modern yoga understand it than Patanjali's yoga does. In spite of Patanjali being called the quote-unquote classical yoga, I don't think he has that much to do with modern yoga compared to Shiva worshippers like Kaundinya. Some of you may know that Pashupati is the name of a form of Shiva. It means the Lord of creatures. Pati, Lord, Pashu, creatures. And a Pashupata is someone who worships that Lord of creatures. So this was a competing school of yoga around the same time as Patanjali. And they thought that Patanjali's liberation was a fake liberation. And they even called people who follow Patanjali's yoga Pashus, beasts, people who are unenlightened, that's a technical term, but it's also, he's dissing Patanjali's yoga, saying you don't get liberated through Patanjali yoga, you're still a beast, you're like a livestock, basically. You're this cow in the backyard being yoked by the Lord. You're not liberated through Patanjali yoga, because you've completely misunderstood what yoga is all about. So here's an example of yoga meaning samyoga, union, not disunion. So that's another understanding. And of course, Kaundinya and other Pashupatas would say that Shiva is the absolute God. He's not just the destroyer. I know sometimes you learn in Hinduism 101 he's the destroyer God. He is the creator, he is the preserver, and he is the destroyer. Everything comes from Shiva, according to the Shaivas, Shiva worshippers, like these Pashupatas. And so some of these Shiva worshippers read the Yoga Sütras of Patanjali and said, wait a second, we need to fix this. There's a problem here with this definition of yoga and with this definition of the Lord. So a text I translated a few years ago for SUNY Press, Lord Shiva's song, the iSvara-Gita. You may be familiar with the Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad is a word that refers to Lord Krishna. Well, Ishvara here refers to Lord Shiva. Lord Shiva says, this is what yoga is. So he starts with these 8 limbs. Breath control, meditation, sense withdrawal, concentration, absorption, abstentions, observances, and posture. Best of sages, yoga is the focusing of the mind solely on me, that is to say Shiva, through cessation of other mental activity. I have just told you its 8 means. So, see what he's doing here? He says, yeah, sure, there are 8 limbs. That's the preparatory practice for the true yoga, which is focusing on the mind solely on me. The highest yoga is not cessation of all mental activity, chitta vritti nirodha. It's cessation of all other mental activity except absorption in Shiva. So clearly he's referring to Patanjali. Patanjali, this is about 400 years after Patanjali wrote the Yoga Sutra. These Shaivas, these Shiva worshippers, knew what Patanjali said, and they're like, yeah, no, that's not right. Patanjali's yoga is a preparatory practice toward the highest yoga, which is absorption in the Lord Shiva. And, incidentally, when you achieve this absorption, you get all of Shiva's powers. You become an Ishvara yourself. Pashupatas compare it to if there's a lit candle and you take an unlit candle and place it, put it in contact with that flame, you light up yourself. That's what happens when we have this contact, this meditative absorption, samadhi in Shiva, according to these Shiva worshippers. So this is another reading of Patanjali that says, yeah, actually, Ishvara is Shiva, the highest, absolute, omnipotent, omniscient creator God. Other Vaishnavas, I don't have time to go into that now, worshippers of Vishnu, you can guess what they said, right? Some commentators like Vijnana Bhikshu in the 16th century said, actually, this is Vishnu. So part of the beauty of the Patanjali Yoga Sutra, or you could say part of the maddening part of it, is it's open to this reinterpretation, it's ambiguous. And I would just throw out there that one of the marks of a classic text, I know St. John's is very much into the Eastern classics and Western classics. Classic texts like the Patanjali Yoga Sutra often are vague and open to constant reinterpretation through the lens of people in later times finding meaning in those texts, not necessarily the meanings that perhaps the author intended. That's fine, that's a creative reinterpretation of these texts, and we find that over and over and over again in the interpretations of Patanjali, whether by modern scholars like Eliade, who wants to talk about an archetypical yoga and a kind of vibration in common with the Ishvara and the yogi, that's one interpretation, or interpreting him as Shiva or Vishnu, etc. So those are the first and second interpretations. I'm going to introduce a third interpretation, and because I'm a historian of philosophy, I'm going to look at some other texts from that first millennium CE, written in Sanskrit in India, to try to see if they can help us out to figure out what Patanjali might have been talking about when he talks about iSvara. So I mentioned that Patanjali is a Sankhya philosopher. There were a lot of other Sankhya texts in the first millennium. One of them you probably haven't heard of, even if you're a scholar of ancient Indian classics. It's called the Yukti Dipika. It's a commentary on a Samkhya source text called the Samkhya Karaka, the verses on Samkhya. Yukti Dipika means the lamp of reasoning. And there we have this dialogue between a Shiva worshipper, somebody like Kaundinya, those Pashupatas, and a Sankhya. And so the Samkhya is responding to the Shiva worshipper, says, you guys are a bunch of godless barbarians. You don't have any respect for iSvara. The Yukti Dipika says, no, actually we do believe in iSvara. So here's what it says. Responding to the Shiva worshipper. You do not understand our intended meaning. We do not reject completely the particular power of the Lord from his assuming a majestic body, etc. Our intended meaning is just that there is no being who is different from Prakriti and Purusha, who is the instigator of these two, as you claim. Therefore, your view is refuted. The conjunction between Prakriti and Purusha is not instigated by another being. So this Sankhya is saying, no, we're not atheists. I know some of you, if you read an Indian philosophy textbook, I might have said Samkhyas are atheists. That's not quite right. Most of the Samkhya texts I've read are not, strictly speaking, atheist or nir Ishvara. That's the word, without God, nir, without Ishvara, God. So that's one of the words in Sanskrit we use for an atheist. And then the opposite of that would be sa Ishvara, or if you know Sandhi, Seishvara, with God, a theist. Most of the Samkhya texts I've actually encountered are talking about Ishvara, but not in a way that the Shiva worshippers talk about it. So he's not some 26th principle. Remember those 25 principles? He's not some like higher principle beyond all the other principles that controls them all. He is a Purusha. He is eternally free. And this is interesting. He takes a majestic body, a Mahatmya Sharira. So he takes some kind of incarnation in the world. Sounds a little bit like, if you know the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna talks about how I take birth time and time again to teach mortals. Something like that is going on. This compassionate yogi, this Lord of all yogis, the Ishvara, is taking a body. He has some kind of agency. He's not omnipotent, but he still has some kind of power to teach people. Remember, Patanjali calls him the teacher of even the ancients because he is not bound by time. So that's another view. You might call it a kind of middle way between Eliade's view, this kind of extreme view of God is completely powerless. He has no Shakti, he has no power. And God is all-powerful. That's the Pashupata view. God has some power, he has some potency in the world, he can teach us, he's compassionate, but he's not an absolute creator God. So this is the evidence we see in texts like the Yukti Dipika. We also see it in a text called Gaudapada's commentary on the Samkhya Karaka. In another first millennium text called the Matara Vritti, it even gives a name to one of these Mahatmya Shariras, these majestic bodies. It names the majestic body as Kapila. Kapila, some of you may know, is the mythical founder of the Samkhya philosophical system, this dualistic philosophical system. So this is a 6th century Common Era Sankhya text. It says, in fact, we do know who this Ishvara is. Some of us have even met him because Kapila is the embodiment, you might even call him an avatar, of Ishvara. He's come down to teach us this liberating philosophy. He's here with us. He has agency. He's a teacher in the world. That's who Kapila actually is. He's actually Ishvara, who has taken a majestic body. So, with the remainder of my time, I'm surprised I'm actually being very punctual. I want to talk a bit about some parallels between Buddhism. Some of you may have encountered some Buddhist texts, and I think it's very clear, as I hinted at before, that Patanjali is not just a Sankhya philosopher. He's a Sankhya philosopher who's deeply influenced by Buddhist psychology and phenomenology. So some of you who have read this text may know that he talks about the Brahma Viharas, this famous Buddhist teaching that you should radiate loving kindness, compassion, equanimity, and sympathetic joy, mudita, to all beings. So for instance, when you're sitting in your Theravada Vipassana Buddhist meditation and you engage in a metta, a loving kindness meditation, that's the first of these 4 Brahma Viharas, or abodes of Brahma. We find that exact same list in the first chapter of the Yoga Sutras. So unlike a lot of religious people today, Patanjali was not particularly interested in these boundaries, these walls between different traditions. He was very happy to borrow yogic meditation traditions like this projection of these positive affective states like loving kindness, compassion, equanimity, and sympathetic joy as part of his meditative system, even though they came from Buddhism. So another feature of Patanjali's text is, I think we might compare this Ishvara of Patanjali to a Mahayana Bodhisattva. Some of you may know that this is a doctrine we don't find in the earliest stratum of Buddhism, but in Mahayana Buddhism, starting sometime maybe the 1st or 2nd century CE, we have this new ideal in Buddhism of a bodhisattva, a wisdom being. Popularly, this is often thought of as someone who postpones their own final liberation, parinirvana, for the sake of all sentient beings, to save beings from suffering. So this bodhisattva takes embodiment again and again in this unhappy realm of samsara for the sake of all beings, to save them from suffering. Another similarity between Buddhism and Samkhya is at the very beginning of the Samkhya-karika, it talks about suffering as the fundamental problem that has to be overcome. Dukkha is also the first noble truth of Buddhism. So there are so many commonalities between Samkhya and Buddhism. So perhaps we could think of this Ishvara as being like a bodhisattva, this compassionate being who takes a body again and again and again for the sake of sentient beings, instead of enjoying his, pure suffering-free liberation apart from the world. The one big difference between Ishvara of the Patanjali Yoga and Sankhya schools and the Bodhisattva is the Bodhisattva was once like us. He or she was bound by karma, by the fruits of karma, by the 5 afflictions, suffered just as we do. The Bodhisattva overcame that suffering, and then out of compassion chose to be reborn again and again. The Sankhya Lord, by contrast, has never suffered, has never been subject to the afflictions, has never been subject to karma or the fruits of karma. And so that being is eternally free. So I think I'm going to stop my talk there, but I'd really love to hear your questions or comments. I think we're going to take about maybe 10 minutes to take a little breather, and then, I know I've thrown a whole lot of concepts and words and Sanskrit terms at you, and I'd be happy just to clarify, or if you're interested in other kinds of comparisons, I think I'm very, very happy to answer any of those questions. So thank you very much for coming.